My name is Madison. I'm in my mid 30s now, but at the time this story began, I was just past 30, old enough to know how systems work, young enough to still believe they usually work fairly. I worked in corporate finance, not in a flashy role, not in leadership. I was the person behind the numbers, the one who checked, reconciled, documented, and quietly made sure things added up. People tend to describe me the same way: calm, reliable, low drama. I've been called steady, easy to work with, and once, by someone who meant it as a compliment, non threatening. I don't raise my voice. I don't dominate rooms. I listen more than I speak. And because of that, people often assume I don't notice much. They're usually wrong. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not about outsmarting someone in a dramatic showdown or delivering a perfectly timed speech that leaves a room in silence. There's no yelling, no exposure posts, no viral moment. What happened unfolded slowly, quietly, and mostly out of sight. It's the story of how my boss used a confidential hotline, one meant to protect employees, to report me for fraud he himself had been running. And how compliance didn't start by calling him. They called me first, because the bank statements told the rest. But this story doesn't start there. It starts with how I was seen, or more accurately, how I wasn't. For a long time, I existed in that invisible middle space so many workplaces depend on. Trusted enough to handle sensitive information, overlooked enough to never be considered a threat. I wasn't ambitious in a way that made people nervous. I wasn't loud enough to be memorable. I wasn't difficult enough to manage out. And I thought that was safety. What you'll hear over the next hour or so is not a rise and fall arc. It's an emotional narrowing, a gradual shift from assuming good intent to noticing patterns, to understanding exactly how power misjudges quiet people. There are moments when I stay silent when others might speak, moments where nothing seems to happen, moments that at the time felt insignificant. They weren't. I'm telling this story now because I've noticed how often narratives like this get flattened, reduced to HR drama or office politics. What actually happened was about moral boundaries, patience, and the kind of leverage that comes not from aggression, but from accuracy. I won't exaggerate anything here. I won't simplify it into heroes and villains, and I won't pretend I was perfect or all-knowing. I stayed longer than I should have. I rationalized things I shouldn't have. I benefited from the same system that later tried to crush me. But I didn't lie, I didn't steal, and I didn't panic. If you've ever been underestimated in a room where decisions were being made about you or using you, this story might feel familiar in ways you don't expect. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that being seen as harmless wasn't the same as being safe? At work, I was known as dependable in the way furniture is dependable. Useful, necessary, and largely unnoticed unless something went wrong. My title sounded more important on paper than it felt in practice. I worked in finance operations, close enough to money to carry responsibility, far enough from power to carry none. I handled reconciliations, reviewed transactions, and prepared internal reports that executives skimmed and then approved without question. I was looped into emails marked confidential, but rarely into conversations where decisions were actually made. People came to me when they needed something fixed quietly. They didn't come to me when they needed an opinion. In meetings, I usually sat slightly back from the table. Not intentionally. It just happened that way. I took notes, I followed up. I filled in gaps when someone forgot a figure or needed clarification. When I spoke, it was factual, short, precise. I never competed for airtime, and no one competed with me for it either. That created a specific impression. To my boss, I was solid. That was his word. Solid meant I didn't surprise him. It meant I didn't escalate things. It meant I didn't ask questions in ways that forced him to explain himself. When he introduced me to others, he'd say, "Madison keeps us honest," and laugh lightly, as if that honesty was procedural, not personal. To my coworkers, I was safe. The person you could vent to without worrying that it would spread. The one who'd help you untangle a mess without making you feel stupid for creating it. I wasn't part of any inner circle, but I wasn't excluded either. I existed in that neutral zone where you're trusted but not influential. And to senior leadership, if I existed at all, I was a line item. a name attached to accurate reports. I didn't resent any of this at first. In fact, I leaned into it. I told myself that staying neutral was professional, that visibility was overrated. If I just did good work consistently, the right people would notice eventually. I believed that competence spoke for itself, even if quietly. Looking back, that belief explains a lot. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't feel like exclusion. It feels like peace. No politics, no scrutiny, no expectations beyond doing your job well. And for someone like me, someone who values clarity and order, that felt comfortable. What I didn't realize was that comfort can look a lot like consent from the outside. Because while I saw myself as careful, others saw me as compliant. When processes changed without explanation, I adjusted. When extra responsibilities appeared without discussion, I absorbed them. When something didn't make sense, I flagged it once, maybe twice, and then moved on when the response was vague. Not because I didn't care, because I didn't want to be difficult. There's an unspoken hierarchy in most organizations, not of titles, but of friction. People who create friction get noticed, sometimes promoted, sometimes pushed out. People who remove friction are protected, right up until they aren't. At that stage of my career, I thought removing friction was the point. My boss, especially, seemed to appreciate that I didn't challenge him publicly. He trusted me with access, systems, accounts, historical records because I didn't question why he needed things handled a certain way. I focused on how. That trust felt earned. And maybe at first it was. But trust, when it goes unexamined, becomes an assumption. And assumption is dangerous when power is uneven. I was assumed to be loyal because I was quiet, ethical because I was thorough, harmless because I was calm. No one considered that those same traits made me observant. No one wondered what I noticed while I was reconciling numbers no one else wanted to look at. Or what patterns form when you're the person connecting accounts month after month, year after year. I wasn't hiding anything. I wasn't preparing anything. I was just doing my job with care. But to them, I was predictable, contained, part of the background machinery. And when someone sees you that way long enough, they stop imagining that you might one day move. They stop imagining you might choose something different. At that point in the story, I didn't see myself as underestimated. I saw myself as trusted. I didn't know yet how thin that line really was. The first moment didn't feel important when it happened. That's the thing about small cuts. You don't register pain right away. You notice them later, when something stings for no clear reason. It was a routine reconciliation review. Monthly. Predictable. I had flagged a discrepancy between two internal accounts. Nothing dramatic, just a transfer that didn't align with the documented purpose. I wrote a neutral note, attached the backup, and sent it to my boss the way I always did. His response came quickly. "Looks fine, close it." No explanation, no acknowledgement of the mismatch, just those 3 words. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. Not because I thought he was wrong, but because this wasn't how he usually responded. He typically appreciated detail, or at least he used to. I replied once carefully. "Just confirming, should we update the description to reflect the destination account?" That was it. No accusation, no resistance, just clarity. The reply that came back an hour later was colder. "Don't overthink this, it's already been reviewed." That was the cut. Small, clean, easy to ignore. In the office, no one noticed anything. I didn't mention it to anyone else. I closed the item, documented the approval, and moved on. That's what professionals do, that's what I told myself. But something shifted internally. Not alarm, more like awareness. The way you become aware of a sound you can't unhear once you've noticed it. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. Nothing overt, just subtle adjustments in tone. When I asked clarifying questions, answers got shorter. When I included more detail than requested, I was told to keep it high level. Once, during a team meeting, I explained a variance, and he interrupted me mid-sentence. "Madison's got it," he said to the room. "It's handled." It sounded supportive. Everyone took it that way. I felt something tighten anyway, because it wasn't true. It wasn't handled. It was documented, yes, filed, closed, but not resolved. After the meeting, a coworker smiled at me and said, "Nice save." I didn't correct her. That's how these things survive, through silence that looks like agreement. I started noticing that my questions were welcome only when they aligned with outcomes already decided. If they complicated things, even slightly, they were brushed aside. And each time, I told myself a reasonable story. He's under pressure, deadlines are tight, this is above my pay grade. Those explanations felt mature, balanced, non-reactive. But beneath them was something else, a growing sense that my role wasn't to understand anymore. It was to process. The first real test came during a quarter-end close, another discrepancy, larger this time. Still not catastrophic, but unusual enough to warrant attention. I flagged it privately, the way I always did. His reply didn't address the issue at all. "Why are you digging into this now?" he wrote. "We don't need noise before reporting." Noise. That word stayed with me. Because what I'd flagged wasn't noise, it was data. I considered pushing back. I even typed out a longer response, explaining the risk of leaving it unexamined. Then I deleted it, rewrote something shorter, neutral. "Understood. Argumenting per guidance." And that was the moment something important happened, though I didn't name it yet. I learned where the line was. Not a written policy line, an emotional one. On one side, competence that made him look good. On the other, curiosity that slowed him down. I crossed back to the safe side and stayed there. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still did my job, still delivered clean reports, still received positive performance feedback. If anything, my boss seemed more relaxed with me again. Internally, I adjusted too, but not in the way anyone noticed. I stopped asking certain questions out loud. I didn't stop noticing the answers. That first small cut healed over quickly, but it left a mark, a thin one, easy to miss unless you were looking closely. And I was starting to look more closely than anyone realized. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It settles in quietly, like dust. If you're not careful, you start mistaking it for part of the environment. After that first cut, nothing dramatic happened. That's important. There was no blow-up, no confrontation, no moment where I could clearly say, "This is wrong." Instead, there was repetition, subtle, consistent, and always justifiable. Emails where my name was left off threads I had always been included in. Decisions are made using my reports without looping me into follow-up discussions. Questions I raised that were acknowledged with a thumbs-up reaction and then ignored. Each instance, on its own, was easy to excuse. He's busy. Someone must have assumed I already knew. This isn't personal. And I believed those explanations because believing them required the least disruption to my sense of stability. What changed was not the behavior. It was my participation in it. I began to pre-edit myself. I'd read an email, notice a potential issue, and then decide whether it was worth it to mention, worth the sigh, worth the delay, worth being seen as difficult. More often than not, I decided it wasn't. That's how normalization works. You don't lower your standards all at once. You lower them by degrees, telling yourself you're being practical. In meetings, I spoke less. Not because I had nothing to add, but because I could predict the response. A quick acknowledgement, a pivot to something else. Sometimes my boss would rephrase my point a few minutes later and present it as his own, not maliciously, almost unconsciously. No one noticed, or if they did, they didn't think it mattered. I noticed, but I didn't react. At performance review time, my feedback was glowing, reliable, detail-oriented, a stabilizing presence. He told me he appreciated how I didn't get caught up in hypotheticals. I smiled. I thanked him. I wrote down the notes. And then I went back to my desk and reconciled accounts that no one else wanted to touch. There's a strange cognitive split that happens when you're praised and dismissed at the same time. On paper, I was valued. In practice, I was being slowly sidelined from understanding the why behind things. I told myself that wasn't my lane anyway. That's the rationalization I'm least proud of. Because it's one thing to be excluded, it's another to help maintain the exclusion by agreeing with it internally. The disrespect became procedural. Deadlines were moved up without notice, and I was expected to adjust. Requests came in labeled urgent, that clearly weren't. When I pushed back once, politely, with documentation, I was told, "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." That phrase came up often. "Don't make it bigger, keep it simple. We'll circle back later." Later never came. What did come was a quiet erosion of boundaries. Not ethical ones, those I held on too tightly, but professional ones. The kind that says your time matters, your perspective matters, your understanding matters. I still believed in the work, in accuracy, in doing things correctly. So I compensated. I worked more carefully, double-checked more thoroughly. If I were going to be excluded from conversations, I would at least make sure the numbers were indisputable. That felt like control. In reality, it was preparation. I just didn't know it yet. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, when a colleague asked me, half joking, "How do you stay so calm? I'd lose it if someone talked to me like that." I laughed it off, said something about thick skin, professionalism. But the truth was I wasn't calm. I was contained. And containment, when sustained too long, turns into pressure. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself this was temporary. Those things would rebalance. That my boss trusted me even if his communication style had shifted. What I didn't fully acknowledge was that trust had become one-directional. I was expected to absorb uncertainty without offering any of my own, to execute without context, to clean up without asking who made the mess. And I did, repeatedly. Not because I lacked self-respect, because I believed patience was a strength. That belief wasn't entirely wrong, it was just incomplete. I hadn't yet seen that patience, unreciprocated, can be mistaken for permission. And once that permission is assumed, it's very hard to take back without consequences. At this stage of the story, nothing had broken. No rules had been violated that I could point to cleanly. No line crossed that demanded action. But the pattern was there. And patterns, once established, don't stay small. Roles aren't always given explicitly. Sometimes they form around you, shaped by what you tolerate and what you don't interrupt. By the time I became aware of mine, it was already well established. I was the reliable one, the closer, the person you handed things to when you wanted them finished without questions. My boss didn't introduce me as someone who analyzed risk or challenged assumptions anymore. He introduced me as someone who made things disappear. That should have unsettled me more than it did. In practice, my role was simple. Take complexity, remove friction, and return something clean enough to pass inspection. I was no longer expected to contribute insight, only output. And I complied, not enthusiastically, not blindly, but consistently. There's a quiet reward system that reinforces this kind of role. When you don't push back, you're given access. When you don't slow things down, you're trusted with more responsibility. When you don't ask why, you're considered easy. I became very easy. I was looped into more sensitive processes, more restricted accounts, and more back-end reporting. Not because I was being groomed for leadership, but because I was seen as safe hands, hands that wouldn't tremble, hands that wouldn't point. At the same time, my influence shrank. I wasn't asked how to improve systems. I wasn't consulted on changes that directly affected my workload. I found out about decisions after they'd already been made, usually framed as fates accompli. This is how we're doing it now. No discussion, no context. I adjusted. I told myself that adaptability was a skill, that ego had no place in good work, that my value wasn't tied to recognition. All of that is true, up to a point. The problem with being assigned the role of reliable is that reliability becomes an obligation, not a contribution. You're expected to absorb stress without reflecting it back, to compensate without credit, to notice problems without naming them. I remember one afternoon when my boss dropped by my desk, unannounced, hurried. "I need you to rerun last quarter's numbers with a different classification," he said. "Nothing major. Just move it so it lines up with the narrative." The word narrative landed heavier than it should have. I asked one question, just one. "Is this a reclassification going forward or retroactive?" He paused, just briefly, then smiled. "Let's not get into semantics. I trust you." Trust again. Always trust. I did the work. I documented the change. I noted the approval. Everything by the book. On paper, it was defensible. Technically correct. But something in me went very still, because I understood then exactly what role I was playing. I wasn't there to prevent problems. I was there to launder them, clean them up so they fit accepted structures. Not illegally, not obviously, just enough to smooth over edges. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me cautious. From that point on, I treated my role differently. If I were going to be the person who touched everything quietly, then I needed to be precise about how I touched it. I documented more thoroughly, saved more versions, not out of fear, out of clarity. If I were being trusted without transparency, then my only protection would be accuracy. I didn't confront my boss. I didn't refuse the work. That would have broken the role too visibly, too early. Instead, I accepted the role fully. Reliable, useful, invisible. And within that invisibility, I began to see the full shape of what was moving around me. I noticed which accounts were rushed, which explanations were reused, which transactions were always already reviewed. I noticed how often my boss positioned me as a buffer, between questions and answers, between oversight and execution. I wasn't being set up as a scapegoat, not yet. But I was being positioned as a shield. At the time, I still believed the system itself was sound, that if something was truly wrong, it would surface through the proper channels. Audits, reviews, controls. What I didn't yet understand was how easily those channels could be redirected, and how dangerous it is to be the quiet person standing closest to the redirection point. I stayed in my role because it felt safer than disrupting it. I didn't know then that staying in the role was exactly what would make leaving it, when the time came, so consequential. The shift didn't happen during a meeting, or an argument, or a discovery. It happened during a pause. I was alone in the office early one morning, the kind of quiet that only exists before emails start landing and calendars begin dictating your attention. I had a cup of coffee cooling beside me and a routine task on my screen, monthly reconciliations I could almost do from memory. Almost. One line item slowed me down, not because it was wrong in an obvious way, but because it was familiar. The same amount, the same timing, the same vague description I'd seen before more than once across different months. Normally, I would have noted it, matched it to prior approvals, and moved on. Instead, I stopped, not out of suspicion, out of fatigue. There's a point where your body notices patterns before your mind is ready to interpret them. Something in me was tired of smoothing things over, even internally, tired of telling myself that consistency meant legitimacy. I didn't open a new file. I didn't start an investigation. I didn't even change what I was doing. I just lingered. I pulled up the prior months, not in a dramatic montage-worthy way, just clicking backward. January, December, November. The same shape appeared again and again. At first, my instinct was to minimize it. Of course, it looks repetitive. It's probably scheduled. That explanation had served me well before. But this time I checked the schedule. It didn't match. That should have triggered something louder. Panic, maybe. Or adrenaline. It didn't. What I felt was clarity. Not aha, not fear. Clarity. I realized in that moment that I had been operating under an unspoken rule. I only followed threads I was invited to follow. If something wasn't directly in my scope, I didn't pull on it. That rule had kept me comfortable. It had also kept me shallow. And the thought that came next wasn't, what is this? It was, what else have I chosen not to see? I sat back in my chair and let that question sit. No judgment, no urgency, just honesty. I thought about the emails I'd stopped sending, the questions I'd reframed into statements, the discrepancies I'd documented without resolving. None of those actions was unethical on their own. Together, they formed a pattern of avoidance. That realization wasn't about my boss. It was about me, about how easily professionalism can slide into self-silencing. How often do we confuse being calm with being passive? I finished the reconciliation, closed the books, did everything exactly as required. But internally, something had realigned. From that day forward, silence stopped being automatic. It became intentional. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't change my demeanor. No one noticed anything different about me at all. But I began to choose when I stayed quiet, instead of defaulting to it. I started keeping mental notes, not accusations, observations, dates, repeated behaviors, language patterns. I didn't frame them as evidence. I framed them as context. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I'd been avoiding. That the system wasn't failing accidentally. That someone understood exactly how quiet people like me kept things moving. And that I had been placed very carefully where I was. The shift wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was strategic. I still believed in fairness. Still believed most people act in good faith. I just stopped assuming that silence was the same as neutrality. That morning ended like any other. Emails, meetings, small talk. But I walked out of the office that evening with a different posture. Not visible, but internal. I was no longer just inside the system. I was watching it. Once silence becomes a choice, it changes texture. Before, my quietness had been reflexive. A habit shaped by training, temperament, and the belief that restraint was professionalism. Now it was deliberate, measured, contextual. And that made all the difference. I didn't suddenly start speaking up more. In fact, from the outside, I probably seemed even quieter. I stopped filling gaps, stopped preemptively solving problems that weren't assigned to me. If something wasn't clearly in my scope, I waited for it to be brought to me, formally. That alone altered the rhythm of how people interacted with me. My boss noticed first, though not consciously. Requests became more specific. Instructions are more carefully worded. He started putting things in writing that he used to say casually in passing. At the time, I didn't interpret that as suspicion. I saw it for what it was, adaptation. When you stop offering frictionless compliance, people adjust their grip. Silence, when chosen, creates space, and space makes patterns louder. I began to notice how often urgency was manufactured. How frequently did phrases like, "We've already cleared this," appear without any record of that clearance? How decisions were framed as settled, not because they were resolved, but because revisiting them would be inconvenient. Still, I said nothing, not because I was afraid, because I was listening. There's a misconception that staying quiet means doing nothing. In reality, it often means doing more, just not in visible ways. I paid closer attention to timing, to whom was CC'd and who wasn't, to which approvals were verbal and which were written. I didn't collect evidence, I didn't download files or create shadow folders. That would have crossed a line I wasn't willing to cross. What I did was keep my work pristine. Every reconciliation is tied cleanly to documentation. Every adjustment is clearly attributed. Every exception noted, even if it wasn't resolved. I stopped smoothing language to protect feelings. I used neutral, precise phrasing and let it stand. If something was approved verbally, I followed up with a written confirmation. Not accusatory, just factual. Per our conversation proceeding as discussed. Those words are unremarkable. They're also powerful. My boss never objected. He didn't push back. He just started replying with shorter acknowledgments. Okay. Noted. Thanks. That told me everything I needed to know. Others, meanwhile, mistook my silence for disengagement. A colleague once asked if I was still enjoying the work. Another joked that I had checked out. I smiled and said I was busy. That wasn't a lie. I was busy choosing not to absorb what wasn't mine to carry. There's a subtle dominance in restraint that people misunderstand. They assume quiet means pliable, that if you're not asserting yourself, you're available to be shaped. What they miss is that shaping requires access, and I was quietly reducing access. Not to systems, I still had those, but to my energy, my assumptions, my willingness to normalize things that didn't sit right. I stopped giving the benefit of the doubt automatically. Instead, I waited to see if it was earned. Nothing exploded because of this shift. No alarms went off. If anything, things seemed smoother. Fewer questions, faster closes. That's the irony. When you stop compensating for structural issues, the structure doesn't collapse right away. It just becomes more honest. I could see where the pressure points were, where my role had been quietly absorbing risk, and I could see how easily that risk could be misdirected if someone chose to. That realization didn't make me anxious. It made me patient. Because patience, unlike passivity, has a direction. I wasn't waiting for something bad to happen. I wasn't hoping to catch anyone. I was simply aligning myself with reality instead of narrative. And in doing so, I became much harder to move. The people around me didn't sense resistance. They sensed neutrality. What they didn't realize was that neutrality, when intentional, is no longer neutral. It's a position. And from that position, you can see exactly who assumes you're not paying attention. Preparation doesn't always look like preparation. There were no late nights fueled by adrenaline, no secret spreadsheets labeled in code, no moment where I told myself, this is it. I'm building a case. That kind of thinking would have pulled me out of alignment with the way I work best. What I did instead was refine. I refined how I documented, how I labeled, how I closed loops. Everything I produced became boring in the most defensible way possible. I stopped summarizing away complexity. If a transaction required context, I included it, briefly, accurately, without interpretation. If something didn't resolve, I noted that it remained open. I didn't escalate it. I didn't editorialize. I let the record speak for itself. Most people don't read records closely unless they have a reason to. That's what my boss was counting on. What he didn't notice was how much of the organization's memory flowed through my hands. I touched historical data constantly, month-over-month comparisons, year-over-year roll-ups, adjustments that reference prior adjustments. The kind of work that creates continuity, if you're paying attention. And I was paying attention now. I began to see repetition where there should have been variance, explanations that traveled intact across time, copied and reused. The same approvals are referenced again and again, always just enough to justify movement, never enough to explain intent. Still, nothing illegal jumped out. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would justify blowing a whistle or sounding an alarm. That mattered to me, because I wasn't trying to catch anyone. I was trying to understand the shape of the truth. Understanding is quieter than suspicion. It asks better questions. I learned which accounts were sensitive not because of their balances, but because of who avoided discussing them. I noticed which processes were rushed only when certain names appeared, which deadlines were flexible until they suddenly weren't. And I noticed how often my boss positioned himself as a translator between departments. How information passed through him filtered, softened, delayed. That's not inherently wrong. Many leaders do that. It becomes wrong when it's used to isolate. No one noticed my preparation because it didn't look like resistance. I didn't change my tone. I didn't change my output. I didn't ask for meetings or raise concerns. If anything, I became easier to work with. I accepted tasks without comment, delivered on time, closed items cleanly. That consistency created a dangerous illusion that everything was under control. What I was actually doing was removing myself from the emotional economy of the situation. I wasn't seeking reassurance. I didn't need approval. I wasn't looking to be seen. I was aligning my work with a single standard. If this were reviewed independently, would it make sense? That question guided everything. I also started paying attention to something I'd previously ignored: language. The words my boss used when he felt confident versus when he felt rushed. How often he invoked authority instead of explanation. How frequently he leaned on phrases like, "We've always done it this way," or "compliance is aware." Those phrases are meant to end conversations. They also leave fingerprints. There's a kind of arrogance that grows when someone believes they've correctly assessed the people around them. When they think they know who's sharp, who's passive, who's ambitious, who's harmless. My boss believed he understood me completely. I was the quiet one, the processor, the stabilizer. I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't going to challenge him. I wasn't building anything behind the scenes. And because he believed that, he stopped managing what passed through me. He didn't limit my access, didn't obscure documentation, didn't reduce my visibility. Why would he? I had never given him a reason to think I would interpret that access differently. Preparation, in my case, wasn't about accumulation. It was about orientation. I oriented myself toward accuracy over harmony, toward completeness over convenience, toward record over reassurance. And in doing so, I made myself legible to the system in a way I hadn't been before. Still invisible to people, but increasingly visible to processes. That distinction matters. Because when systems eventually ask questions, and they always do, they don't care who was loudest in the room. They care who touched what, when, and how cleanly. By the time I realized how much ground I had quietly covered, it wasn't because something had gone wrong. It was because I could see, with unsettling clarity, exactly where things would go wrong if they were ever examined closely. And I understood something else too. If that examination came, the narrative wouldn't be controlled by the person who spoke the most. It would be controlled by the person who left the clearest trail. The reveal didn't come with shock or satisfaction. No racing heart, no sense of triumph. It came with stillness. I was reviewing bank statements, not as part of a special project, not because of a suspicion, but because they were on my rotation. Routine, mundane, the kind of task that's supposed to confirm what you already believe. Instead, they contradicted it. Not blatantly, not in a way that screamed fraud, in a way that whispered control. Funds moving between accounts that technically allowed it, but operationally didn't need it. Timing that aligned too neatly with reporting cycles. Transfers that reset balances just enough to mask exposure, then quietly reversed weeks later. If you looked at any one statement, it passed. If you looked at them together, over time, they told a different story. I remember leaning back in my chair and feeling something settle rather than rise. This wasn't chaos. This was designed. And the most unsettling part wasn't the pattern itself. It was how familiar it felt. How many times have I seen versions of it without naming it? How often my role had been to reconcile after the movement, not question the movement itself. I didn't print anything, didn't screenshot, didn't call anyone. I just let myself finish the thought I'd been avoiding for months. If this ever comes under review, the story will need a fall person. And I was standing very close to the narrative edge. That was the moment I understood the real leverage I had, and the real risk. Not leverage in the sense of power over someone else. Leverage in the sense of position. The system trusted my work, my timestamps, my approvals, my documentation. If something was wrong, it would look first at the person who touched everything and said nothing. Me. That clarity stripped the emotion out of the situation completely. This wasn't personal. This wasn't about disrespect. This wasn't even about my boss, really. This was about alignment. I saw exactly how a confidential hotline, meant to protect integrity, could be weaponized. How a narrative could be constructed around access and proximity. How easily quiet competence could be reframed as complicity. And I saw something else too. The same records that could implicate me could also exonerate me, if they were read properly. That's the part people miss when they talk about leverage. It's not about having secrets. It's about having structure. I didn't celebrate this realization. I didn't feel clever. I felt sober. Because once you see the truth clearly, you're responsible for how you respond to it. There were no villains in my head, no dramatic conclusions, just a clean assessment. If nothing changed, the risk would continue to accumulate. If something broke, the system would look for the most plausible explanation. And the most plausible explanation would not favor the quiet one. I closed the statements, logged out, went home. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because I felt safe, because I finally felt oriented. The reveal didn't give me answers. It gave me a boundary. I knew exactly what I would and would not allow to happen next. And for the first time since this story began, I wasn't reacting to a role assigned to me. I was deciding how the story could legally, ethically, and cleanly proceed. No confrontation, no exposure, no panic, just clarity, and the weight that comes with it. People imagine decision points as moments of urgency, a deadline, a threat, a clock ticking loudly in the background. This one was quiet. It unfolded over several days, in ordinary moments, waiting for coffee to brew, walking to my car, staring at an email before answering it. The kind of moments where your mind has space to tell you the truth without adrenaline distorting it. I knew what I could do. I could confront my boss privately, lay out what I'd noticed, give him the benefit of explanation. That path relied on his integrity and his fear outweighing his instinct for self-preservation. I could go straight to compliance myself, preemptively, frame everything neutrally. That path relied on timing, interpretation, and the assumption that systems always recognize nuance. Or I could do nothing, continue as before, keep my head down and trust that if anything ever surfaced, my documentation would speak for itself. Each option carried risk. Confrontation would alert him. Once someone knows you see them clearly, they adjust, not always in ethical ways. And I had no illusion that I held more organizational power than he did. Going to compliance myself would escalate things before they were formally questioned. I would be stepping out of my assigned role in a way that couldn't be undone. Even if I was right, the cost would be real, professionally and personally. Doing nothing felt safest on the surface, but it was only safe if the future stayed predictable, and it wouldn't. What made this a true decision point wasn't fear. It was a responsibility. I understood now that my position in the system wasn't neutral. I wasn't a bystander. I was a structural node. Information passed through me, and because of that, my inaction wasn't passive. It was participatory. That realization didn't come with guilt. It came with resolve. I asked myself one question, over and over, until the answer stopped shifting. If this is reviewed later, what choice will I be able to stand behind without explaining myself? Not legally, personally. The answer ruled out doing nothing. It also ruled out confrontation. I wasn't interested in warnings. I wasn't interested in drama. And I wasn't interested in becoming part of a private negotiation where truth could be reframed. What remained was the irreversible option. Not explosive, not loud, just final. I decided that whatever happened next, it would not begin with my emotions or my interpretations. It would begin with a process. I would not accuse. I would not speculate. I would not preemptively defend myself. I would let the system do what it claimed to do, provided it was forced to look in the right order. That meant one thing: I would wait. Not indefinitely, not passively. I would wait for the moment when questions were asked, and answer only what was asked, with precision. That decision required discipline. It meant resisting the urge to get ahead of the story. It meant continuing to do my job without signaling concern. It meant accepting uncertainty in the short term to preserve clarity in the long term. Most people think the hardest part is acting. Sometimes the hardest part is not acting, when you know exactly what's at stake. From the outside, nothing changed after that decision. My boss continued as before. Deadlines, approvals, small pressures. I responded calmly, professionally. Inside, everything was settled. I wasn't waiting to be saved. I wasn't hoping for fairness. I wasn't planning revenge. I had simply chosen the only path that didn't require me to distort myself to survive. Once that choice was made, the rest was execution. Quiet, exact, unmistakable, and irreversible. After the decision was made, the world didn't change. That's something people rarely talk about. The anticlimax of resolve. You expect a shift in atmosphere, some internal drumbeat signaling that everything is different now. Instead, life continues at the same pace. Emails still arrive, calendars still fill, people still make small talk in hallways, and you still show up. Moving in silence doesn't mean freezing. It means becoming exact. I didn't alter my routines. That would have drawn attention. I didn't slow down my work or speed it up. I kept delivering at the same steady pace that had earned me the label reliable. What changed was my precision around process. If something required approval, I waited for it. Clearly, explicitly. If instructions were vague, I asked for clarification in writing, not challengingly, not defensively, just enough to anchor accountability. Can you confirm which account this should post to? Just want to make sure I'm aligning with your direction. Those sentences are invisible to most people. They're also immovable. I stopped interpreting intent. I stopped filling in gaps. I stopped assuming that urgency meant priority. When something arrived late, I documented the timing. When something changed, I noted the version. When explanations were incomplete, I recorded exactly what was provided, no more, no less. I didn't flag issues for compliance. I didn't escalate concerns. I didn't even internally label anything as wrong. I let the system accumulate its own questions. That's the part that requires restraint, not rushing to clarity, letting ambiguity exist long enough that it becomes undeniable. My boss, meanwhile, seemed comfortable. More than comfortable, confident. He delegated freely, spoke casually, referred to oversight as routine. At one point, he joked in a meeting about how compliance never really looks at the boring stuff. I remember smiling politely, because boring is exactly what survives review. There were moments when I felt the pull to intervene, a transaction that could have been framed more cleanly, a timeline that could have been adjusted to avoid scrutiny. I had done those things before instinctively. This time I didn't, not out of malice, out of alignment. I followed the policy, followed documentation standards, followed the order of operations exactly as written, not as implied. If the process allowed something, I processed it. If it required review, I waited for review. If it didn't make sense, I recorded that it didn't make sense, without interpretation. That's how you move in silence without creating shadows. No one noticed because nothing broke. And that's what made it dangerous. For him, the system was quietly being denied the one thing it relied on most: my willingness to smooth. Weeks passed, then months, and still nothing happened. I didn't feel disappointed. I felt prepared. Because moving in silence isn't about forcing an outcome. It's about removing yourself from being the variable that distorts outcomes. I wasn't protecting him anymore. I wasn't exposing him either. I was letting the structure speak in its own language. And structures, when left to themselves, eventually correct or collapse. I didn't know which it would be. I only knew that when something finally did shift, I would be standing exactly where I needed to be, with nothing to explain, nothing to defend, nothing to hide. The first consequence wasn't an accusation. It was a delay, a routine approval that usually came back within a day stretched into a week, then two. No explanation, no rejection, just silence where momentum used to be. At first, I assumed someone was out of the office. It happens. I made a note, adjusted timelines, and moved on. Then another approval stalled. Different account, different reviewer, same outcome. That's when I felt it. Not alarm, not satisfaction, but recognition. The system had started asking questions. Quietly, of course. Not by announcing concern, but by slowing down. By pausing where it used to glide, by refusing to move forward on assumed legitimacy alone. My boss noticed the friction before anyone else did. He stopped by my desk more often, asked casual questions that weren't really casual. Have you heard anything from compliance lately? Are they doing some kind of review? I answered honestly. No one's reached out to me. That was true. What I didn't add was that I could feel the shift in the air. The way requests were now being routed through additional layers. The way explanations were being asked for, gently but persistently. Others began to feel it too, without understanding why. Deadlines slipped. Reports came back with comments instead of approvals. Someone in accounting mentioned that things were getting weird around quarter end. No one connected it to anything specific. There was no single event to point to, just a growing sense that the usual shortcuts weren't working anymore. That's how consequences begin, when they're procedural rather than punitive. They feel like an inconvenience. My boss's tone changed, not toward me, toward the world. He became sharper in meetings, less patient with questions. He started reminding people of his experience, his track record, the trust he'd built. Trust is often invoked right before it's tested. One afternoon, he asked me to reclassify a transaction retroactively. Similar to before, but with a new urgency in his voice. "We need this cleaned up before the next review," he said. "It's not a big deal." I asked for the approval in writing. He hesitated, just a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Sure, I'll send it." He did, and in that moment something subtle but irreversible happened. The record became complete. From that point on, the consequences no longer belonged to any one person. They belonged to the process. Compliance didn't announce an investigation. They didn't freeze accounts or call emergency meetings. They did something much more effective. They asked for documentation, not from him, from the system, from records, from logs, from timelines, and the system responded. People started realizing that certain explanations no longer held up under simple cross-reference, that approvals existed, but didn't align with outcomes. Those patterns emerged when the data was viewed horizontally instead of vertically. My role during this phase was almost non-existent. I answered questions when asked, provided files when requested, explained processes without commentary. No spin, no framing, and no defense. I didn't need to say anything. The consequences were no longer emotional. They were operational. And operational consequences don't care how confident you sound in meetings. They care about sequence. By the time my boss realized something was truly wrong, it was already too late to identify where the shift had begun. From his perspective, things had simply stopped working the way they always had. From mine, the system had finally caught up to the truth it had been carrying quietly all along. Panic doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like urgency dressed up as leadership. More meetings, more emails, more reminders about alignment and trust and getting ahead of things. That's what my boss shifted into. He started requesting status updates on work that had already been submitted, asked for summaries of summaries, wanted verbal confirmations for items that were already documented. It was control-seeking behavior, but not aggressive, anxious. He still didn't accuse anyone. He still didn't confront me directly. Instead, he tried to reassert narrative. "This is just a routine check. They do this every few years. Nothing to worry about if everything's clean." Those statements weren't for me. They were for himself. Because by then, it was clear that reassurance wasn't coming. Compliance questions grew more specific. They weren't asking what anymore. They were asking why. Why did this account move this way? Why is this approval referenced to an earlier exception? Why is timing consistently aligned with reporting cycles rather than operational needs? Those are not questions you can answer retroactively without leaving fingerprints. I watched my boss attempt to fix things the only way he knew how, by tightening his grip. He asked me once, carefully, if I remembered why a particular process had been set up the way it was. I answered truthfully, "No, that predates me. I've just been following documented guidance." That was the moment I saw fear flash across his face, not because of what I said, but because of what I didn't say. I wasn't covering, I wasn't speculating, I wasn't filling in gaps for him. I was doing exactly what the system expects when it's under review, sticking to the record. He tried a different angle, softer. "You've always had a good sense of context," he said. "You understand the bigger picture." I looked at him and said calmly, "I understand my role." That ended the conversation. From that point on, his attempts to fix things only made them worse. Every clarification created a new inconsistency. Every justification introduced a new timeline that didn't align with the last. That's the trap of late-stage control, when you realize too late that the story was never yours to fully manage. Meanwhile, the consequences spread outward. A planned initiative was paused. An approval chain was temporarily rerouted. Someone from finance leadership started attending meetings they hadn't attended before. The air in the office changed. People spoke more carefully. Jokes disappeared. Even casual emails took on a formal tone. No one said my boss's name, but everyone felt the gravity shift. He stopped delegating, then he started over-delegating. He asked for reassurance and bristled when he didn't get it. He oscillated between confidence and irritation. What he didn't do, not once, was ask me what I knew. That was his final mistake. Because by then the system wasn't interested in what anyone knew. It was interesting to see what could be shown. And what could be shown was already locked in. There's a moment in every irreversible process where effort turns into damage, where trying to fix things only accelerates the outcome you're trying to avoid. I could see that moment pass. So could he. And still, there was nothing to say. By the time he realized that no explanation could reconcile the sequence of events, the review had moved beyond interpretation. It was now about accountability. Not emotional accountability, structural accountability. And structures don't negotiate. The confrontation didn't happen in a boardroom. There was no audience, no raised voices, no moment anyone would later describe as explosive. It happened in a small conference room with frosted glass walls and a table that was slightly too big for two people. He asked me to meet late in the afternoon. His message was brief, polite, almost formal. When I walked in, he was already seated. A folder in front of him, not thick, not thin, just enough to feel intentional. He didn't start with an accusation. He started with a sigh. "I want to understand what's going on," he said. "From your perspective." That was new. I sat down, placed my notebook on the table. I didn't open it. "I've been responding to requests as they come," I said, "and following the documented process." He nodded slowly, as if absorbing that. "There seems to be concern," he said, "about some of the financial movements." "I'm aware compliance has questions," I replied. "They've reached out for documentation." "What have you told them?" he asked. The question was careful, measured. "Exactly what they asked," I said, "and only that." Silence filled the space between us. Not tense, just empty. He leaned back slightly, studied me in a way he never had before. "You know how these things work," he said. "Context matters." "I agree," I said. "That's why I rely on the record." That's when I saw it. The moment he realized there was no version of this conversation that would give him what he wanted. Not reassurance, not an alliance, not control. He closed the folder without opening it. "Did you ever think about coming to me?" he asked. I answered honestly. I thought about what my role required. "And what did it require?" he asked. I met his eyes. Accuracy. There was no anger in my voice, no accusation, just a fact. He looked away, rubbed his forehead with one hand. "This could have been handled differently," he said. "Yes," I agreed. Narratum. He waited, as if expecting me to elaborate, to assign blame, to offer an alternative ending. I didn't, because there was nothing left to negotiate. The conversation ended the way it had begun, quietly. He thanked me for my time. I thanked him for his. When I walked out of that room, I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. Not because I had won something, because I hadn't compromised myself to survive it. There's a particular calm that comes from knowing you didn't raise your voice, didn't distort the truth, didn't step outside your values, even when someone else was losing their footing. I returned to my desk, finished the last task of the day, shut down my computer. The story at that point no longer belonged to either of us. It belonged to the system. When everything finally settled, there was no announcement, no email explaining what had happened, no meeting to close the loop. The organization did what organizations do best when something uncomfortable occurs. It absorbed the shock quietly and adjusted its shape. My boss was gone within a few weeks. Not dramatically removed, not publicly disgraced. His name simply stopped appearing on calendars. His office was emptied between a Friday evening and a Monday morning. People spoke about it in careful sentences, if at all. I wasn't asked to explain anything. That told me more than any question could have. My role changed, but not in the way people might expect. I wasn't promoted to his position. I wasn't held up as an example. No one congratulated me for handling things well. Instead, something subtler happened. People started asking me questions before making decisions, not because they were afraid of me, but because they understood instinctively now that accuracy lived here. That's when I said something sounded. It actually was. That was when I asked a question. It mattered. I hadn't demanded authority. I had demonstrated alignment. And alignment is more convincing than ambition. What surprised me most was how little bitterness I felt. I'd expected some residue. Anger, resentment, a desire for acknowledgement. None of that lingered. Because the truth is, I didn't see myself as having been wronged anymore. I saw myself as having been clarified. The version of me who once believed silence was safety feels distant now. Not naive, just incomplete. She didn't yet understand that being underestimated isn't a problem unless you underestimate yourself too. I still work quietly. I still don't dominate rooms. I still prefer records to rhetoric. But now my silence isn't misread because I no longer offer it freely. I set boundaries without announcing them. I document without apologizing. I ask questions without softening them to protect egos. And when I don't know something, I say so. That, I've learned, is real authority. This experience didn't harden me, it sharpened me. I didn't lose faith in systems, but I stopped romanticizing them. Systems don't run on morality, they run on structure. If you understand the structure, you understand where responsibility truly lives. I'm still Madison, still calm, still observant, still largely uninterested in drama, but I am no longer invisible to myself. And that has changed everything. When I look back on this story now, what stays with me isn't the tension or the outcome, it's the restraint. So many moments could have turned into something louder. I could have confronted earlier, escalated emotionally, tried to control the narrative before it formed around me. That path might have felt satisfying in the short term. It also would have required me to become someone I don't recognize. What protected me wasn't aggression, it was alignment. I didn't win because I was smarter, braver, or more ruthless than anyone else. I didn't even outplay my boss in the way stories like this often get framed. What happened was simpler and harder. I stayed where I was. I did my job cleanly. I refused to lie to make things easier. And when the system finally asked questions, I answered them without fear or embellishment. That's the part people underestimate. Integrity doesn't announce itself. It accumulates, quietly, patiently, often unnoticed until the moment it's needed most. The confidential hotline that was eventually used, meant to protect the organization, was never my tool. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. Because by the time it was activated, the story it tried to tell couldn't survive contact with the record. Compliance called me first, not because I was suspected, but because my work was central, consistent, and clear. The bank statements told the rest. There's no revenge in that, no humiliation, just consequence. And that's what I want to leave you with. If you're in a position where you feel underestimated, overlooked, or quietly burdened with responsibility you didn't ask for, you don't need to become louder to protect yourself. You need to become clearer. Clarity in your work, clarity in your boundaries, clarity in what you will and won't absorb. Silence can be powerful, but only when it's chosen, not imposed. Sometimes the most decisive thing you can do is stop smoothing the path for someone else and start walking straight on your own. The world doesn't always reward that immediately. But when accountability finally arrives, it knows exactly where to look. If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear why. Have you ever been in a situation where staying calm and precise mattered more than speaking up? And how did it change the outcome for you? That conversation, I think, is worth having.